We see enormous dynamism also in education, law, and religion, quintupling of the number of distinct occupations. So this is a sign of great creativity in the public sector and in the bureaucracy. But notice what we see for commerce, it's effectively flat. Okay, the number of distinct occupations in commerce is essentially the same. The lag in of the private sector is apparent also in the numbers of new occupations. Far fewer new occupations emerge in commerce than in the bureaucracy, military, and education, law, and religion. Again, that's a sign of greater dynamism in the public sector than in the private sector. Now we can see one reason why the Middle East could not exploit technologies of the Industrial Revolution using indigenous institutions, why it was necessary to borrow organizational forms from abroad. The West eventually formed enterprises with hundreds and thousands of employees and shareholders. And these were durable enterprises. Some of them lasted for generations. So they established reputations. The Middle East could simply not compete with these. Consequently, commerce between the Middle East and Europe fell gradually under the control of Westerners, and the West was able to industrialize, and the Middle East was unable to follow suit or do so on its own. Why couldn't the Middle East simply transplant the organizational forms that gave the West an advantage? Why did Abdul Majid's initiative largely fail for 6 decades? Precisely because of a millennium of organizational stagnation, the preconditions were lacking. Complementary institutions were absent. Let me give you some examples. Modern firms require standardized bookkeeping. In case of disputes, you need judges who are familiar with modern accounting conventions. The Islamic courts, even in the mid-19th century, were unequipped to handle financial cases involving modern firms. In the absence of stock markets, not to mention banks, which also did not emerge in the Middle East, it's difficult to raise the capital that you need to found an industrial company. So you cannot jump from the Islamic partnership to the corporation if all of the institutions that would have to be generated along the way are absent. And this was the situation that confronted Abdul Majid and his lieutenants. To sum up the argument thus far, differences in inheritance systems, the Islamic system was considerably more egalitarian, caused a divergence of commercial institutions, which in turn led to a divergence in economic performance. Now, this isn't a full explanation for why organizational development lagged in the commercial sector. I've shown up to this point why the path in Western Europe, the path that was followed in Western Europe and led to organizational modernization in Western Europe, was not followed also in the Middle East. In principle, however, a different path might have been followed in the Middle East from a different starting point. Economically, the most important non-state organization was what is known in English as the Waqf, in Turkish the Vakıf. Huge amounts of resources flowed into Waqfs in the pre-Ottoman period, also during the Ottoman period. So we need to explain why the Waqf did not stimulate organizational modernization in the private sector. But first, let me provide a broad historical perspective that relates the rise of the Waqf in the Middle East, by going way back to the early Islamic centuries, to the rise of the corporation in Europe. Now, the Waqf is not one of Islam's original institutions. It is not mentioned in the Quran. The Waqf emerges after the rise of Islam. About a century starts being developed about a century after the rise of Islam, and a very dynamic period in Islamic history. Around that time, cities in Western Europe, and guilds and monasteries start declaring themselves as corporations. In Europe, the corporate form is not applied to business and commerce until the 1600s, but by that time there's almost a millennium of experience with the corporate forms. When the need arises for the corporation, when the corporation appears useful in the 1600s, Europe already has almost a millennium of experience with the basic form, and the courts are very accustomed to the concept of a corporation. In the Middle Ages, both Europe and the Middle East were very dynamic in terms of institutions, but they made choices that contributed over the long run to an economic divergence that left the Middle East behind. So what is a waqf in the traditional sense? Not in the sense of a modern Turkish vakıf. Even the Ottoman vakıf is something quite different than what we call a vakıf under modern Turkish law. The traditional waqf was the delivery vehicle for functions met in Western Europe through corporations. It was the Middle East's alternative to the corporation. Thus, practically all urban services in the Middle East were provided by waqfs. You did not have municipalities. You did not have traditionally in the traditional Ottoman system, you did not have what we now call a belediye. Colleges were financed by the waqf, like Al-Azhar in Egypt, and all the madrasas elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire were established as, were financed by waqfs. These were not self-governing organizations, unlike universities, which are self-governing organizations and can decide to renew themselves. That's not the case with the madrasas. So the waqf is a trust that is founded under Islamic law. It is managed by a trustee, a single trustee, in other words, what we now call a mutawalli. The trustee must follow the stipulations that are laid down by the founder to the letter. The waqf is unincorporated. It is not a legal person before the law. It does not have what we call in modern Turkish law tüzel kişilik. It is not self-governing. A waqf is founded by an individual property owner, never a group or a family. It has an endowment. It comes with an endowment that is to be used to provide a particular service that is identified by the waqf founder. And the arrangement, this is very important, the arrangement is to last in perpetuity. In the pre-modern Middle East, a huge variety of services were provided by waqfs. And this institution permitted individuals to supply in a decentralized manner public goods that are now supplied by governments. In some respects, this was an absolutely magnificent system. Precisely because of its lack of centralized control, it was responsive to local needs. Let me show you a few examples, all close to home, of organization services that have been provided by waqfs. Here's a madrasa from nearby Gebze that was supported by a waqf for many centuries. Here in Istanbul, there's several buildings here that were established as waqf. You have a madrasa right here, a hammam right here, the edge of a mosque right there. This is a han, Sarahan in Kayseri. It was also supported by a waqf. Merchants could stay here with their caravans and be protected at night for just a nominal fee. Here's a caravansaray that also had a waqf in Konya, that also had a waqf supporting it. Here's a charitable complex. Almost all of the charitable complexes, the Külliyes in the Ottoman Empire, had waqfs that supported them. This is one of the most beautiful ones near Eskişehir. So the waqf was an immensely important institution economically. And in the Ottoman Empire, depending on the location, between a quarter and half of all real estate was controlled by waqf to support these kinds of services. It happens that the waqf is not among Islam's original institutions. It is not mentioned in the Quran. The earliest evidence of its existence, as I mentioned a little while ago, is from a century after the birth of Islam. So that requires us to ask the question, what prompted this innovation? Okay. Around the 8th and 9th centuries, private property was insecure in the Middle East. Arbitrary taxation and expropriation threatened high officials who tended to be major landowners. These high officials did what wealthy people do everywhere, including today. They looked creatively for an institution to serve as a wealth shelter. Older civilizations in the region, including Roman civilization on which Islam built, had developed various forms of trust. Early Muslims used the basic idea to develop a distinct and very ingenious institution that achieved massive economic significance. Now, why did assets become more secure? Why did they become sheltered when you endowed your assets as a waqf? Regardless of the service that the waqf provided, the waqf was considered sacred, and assets that were converted to waqf were considered sacred, and it was common knowledge that this was widely believed. Consequently, rulers were reluctant to expropriate waqf assets lest they develop a reputation for impiety and lose legitimacy and weaken their regimes. So property owners endowed waqfs to protect their assets, to lower, in other words, the probability of losing property through confiscation and arbitrary taxation. Now, you're probably wondering, if a founder's goal was to shelter assets for his own use, what did he gain by setting up a trust that would, let us say, provide for the upkeep of an inn or a school? Something had to be in the deal for him. This was considered, setting up a waqf was considered a pious act, so we obtained inner satisfaction and also social prestige, but there were also significant material returns. The founder of a waqf could appoint himself as the mutawalli of the waqf for life, and in this capacity he enjoyed various benefits. For one thing, he set his own salary. Secondly, he could place his friends and relatives in various positions. He also designated a successor. Often he designated a child. So the last privilege, the fact that he could designate a child as his successor, this meant that he could circumvent the inheritance law. He could put his property, convert it to a waqf, and then appoint a single child as a successor, effectively disinheriting the other children. So in setting up a waqf, a founder typically did not engage simply in charity. Some of the secured income accrued to the founder, to his family, and to his descendants. But there was a quid pro quo in return for the privilege of sheltering some wealth for personal use. Ordinarily, he accepted certain social responsibilities. In other words, providing some service, supporting the maintenance of a bridge, supporting a mosque, supporting an inn, a school, whatever. This institution provided identifiable benefits to everyone in society. The wealthy, who are the people who have private assets, they obtained from the state a credible promise of material security. Wealth that they converted to waqf was more secure than private wealth. The state committed itself not to expropriate. That's a loss. It's giving up tax revenue. On the other hand, on the positive side, it doesn't have to deliver social services itself. Cities can run on services provided by the wealthy. The state can collect taxes without providing services beyond, of course, law and order. And that is the way that what I just said applies to most of the major Ottoman cities. Even in Istanbul, the vast majority of social services until the second half of the 19th century are provided privately through waqfs, through a decentralized system. And the average person benefits from various subsidized services seen from the standpoint of the average Ottoman citizen or the average citizen of another state run under Islamic law. This was a system that encouraged philanthropy and was responsive to local conditions. So one